is Shooting Star ASMR, and this video is going to be episode 2 of my Wrongful Convictions series. You might remember, if you have been on my channel before, that episode 1 was about Sally Clark, and after a period of not making videos, we are back to continue this series. Please let me know if you would like this series to continue, as I would really love to start it up again and be consistent with it. So, before I begin, I just wanted to say that there is a content warning for this video for descriptions of post-mortem, descriptions of violence, child death, child murder, and not descriptions of sexual assault, but mention of it. So please be aware that if those things are upsetting or disturbing for you, then please don't watch this video. I also wanted to say that this is definitely a controversial case, with discussions around it, which we will get to at the end. So if any of you would like to put your view forward, then the comment section is the perfect place to do that. I will also be discussing my thoughts as well, so let's get into it. The background of the case: Billy Joe Margaret Jenkins was born on the 29th of March 1983 to Deborah Barnett and Bill Jenkins in East London. Debbie and Bill met on a double date, an odd sort of date, while Bill was in Wandsworth Prison. A friend of Debbie's had a partner in the prison and asked Debbie to accompany her to visit the partner and a friend of his, who turned out to be Bill. Bill was serving time for various assaults, including assault of a police officer. The pair began a relationship, and when Bill was released from Wandsworth Prison, he moved into Debbie's flat with her. The couple were married 6 weeks after the birth of their daughter, Billy Joe. Debbie had problems of her own. She was a heavy drinker with a previous arrest for credit card fraud. Debbie struggled to care for and house the children. When Bill was sent to prison again, Billy Joe and her siblings were sent to live with family members. Billy Joe was 8 years old at the time, and after short periods with one of her grandmothers and an aunt, she and her brother were placed into foster care in Ilford, Essex. That placement did not last long, and when Lois Jenkins answered a social services advert for foster parents in her local paper, it must have seemed like fate. Lois Jenkins was a social worker, and her husband, Sean, was a deputy headmaster. They lived in East London at the time with their 4 daughters, one of whom was friends with Billy Joe at school. Both Billy Joe and her brother were initially placed with the Jenkins, although at some point the boy moved back to his birth family, while Billy Joe, now 9, remained with the Jenkins family on long-term foster. The sharing of a surname is purely coincidental. Billy Joe was not related to her foster family. Only weeks after Billy Joe's arrival, Sean Jenkins was appointed deputy headmaster at William Parker School in Hastings, a historic town in East Sussex. Lois and Sean were unsure if Billy Joe would want to go with them, since her school friends and biological family were in London, but she was apparently very enthusiastic about being part of the family and happily made the move to Hastings with them. Stories emerged after her murder about possible problems within their home, but for the most part, Billy Joe was seen as a happy, stable and, quote, fun-loving, unquote, 13-year-old. Her dream was to be an actor, and friends would later speak of how well liked she was at school and how she was destined to be a star. The The Jenkins moved into a large 3-storey semi-detached house in Lower Park Road, overlooking Alexandra Park in Hastings. As you're facing the house, there was a small alley running down the left side with the house on one side and a wall on the other, leading to a wooden gate that enabled access to the back garden. On the other side of the wall was a derelict and boarded up house. The Jenkins house had a front garden which sloped down to the road with a set of steps leading to the alleyway. The house had no driveway, so cars were parked on the road outside. The street itself can be described as comfortably middle class. However, Hastings overall did have some problems with crime, but since it's a fairly small town, it's not easily divided into the good and bad areas. A year before Billy Joe was murdered, 1,000 local residents signed a petition calling for better security at the park, which was known as a place for drug use, underage drinking, and multiple incidences of men flashing women and girls. In 1996, 2 girls were sexually assaulted, and the same year 2 people were murdered in Hastings. Some neighbours of the Jenkins reported that there had been a spate of robberies as well as vandalism in the local area. After the murder of Billy Joe, Sean reported to police that about 2 weeks prior he had seen a man in the park staring into his family's home. They had also found their garden gate open on a number of occasions. A neighbour reported that the Jenkins were worried enough that they had security lights and window locks fitted, and that they were even considering to move. Mr. Gamester, a friend of the family, said he spoke to Sean a few days prior to the murder, when the two discussed how a prowler could have gotten to the back of the house, and that one of the Jenkins cars had been vandalised. However, none of this was reported to the police. At the time of Billy Joe's murder, the Jenkins' biological daughters and their ages were Annie, 12, Lottie, 10, Esther, 8, and Maya, 7. I think it's Maya, but it could be Maya, I suppose. I'm not sure. So, on to the murder itself. Content warning. 15th of February 1997, on the afternoon of Saturday, the 15th of February 1997, Lois had taken the 2 youngest daughters, Esther and Maya, for a walk along the local beach. Lottie, 10, was at a clarinet lesson with a friend. It had been agreed that Sean would pick her up after the lesson finished. In the meantime, Sean, Annie, and Billy Joe were at home. Both girls were earning money by doing chores in the house and in the garden. Billy Joe was particularly keen to earn some money for a pair of trainers that she'd seen in town, which Sean had agreed that she could buy. Initially, Annie was clearing out a utility room at the back of the house where she had found a set of large tent pegs amongst other items. She placed the pegs on top of a coal bunker in the back garden. Billy Joe was also in the back garden and had started to paint the patio doors. As Annie understood, she would be helping her sister with the painting later in the day. Annie's next chore was to wash the family's car, which was parked outside the front of the house. The family owned 3 cars, a Citroen, presumably being used by Lois to take the 2 daughters to the seaside, the Opel, which was being washed by Annie, and a white MG convertible sports car. Sean asked her if she wanted to go with him to collect Lottie from her clarinet lesson, which she agreed to. Billy Joe stayed at home to continue painting. Annie's statements indicate that she did not see Billy Joe in between washing the car and leaving with her dad at about 3 p.m. Sean took his MG for the drive, stating that it was the first time that year he'd been able to have the roof down. Interesting, in February, Sean, with Annie, collected both Lottie and her friend from the clarinet lesson, dropped the friend that Sean was alone in the house for a period of about 3 minutes. Returning to the front of the house, he declared that they needed to go to a DIY store to get more supplies so that Annie could help her sister to paint and to also get white spirit, as Billy Joe had spilt some paint on the patio tiles. The trip to the DIY store, including the route taken, later became a huge point of contention. The Jenkins house faces Alexandra Park. The park effectively has a road running in a loop around it, with Lower Park Road forming the lower part of that loop. The exit from that loop to the DIY store is at the upper left corner of the park. The most direct route to the store is to head left from the house. Sean headed right instead, taking a longer route than he needed to. He contends that his car was parked facing to the right, and it was easier to just drive in that direction rather than do a 3-point turn in the road to go the other way. There is about a 0.3 mile difference between the routes. However, the rest of the journey gets more odd. Before the turn-off for the DIY store, he decides that it is too late for Annie to start painting and heads for home. And that actually makes sense because it was February at the time, so the nights won't have drawn out enough in order for it to be particularly light for painting to happen. Like, it would be getting dark earlier, probably around like 5 o'clock, 5:30, so I kind of understand why he would decide that, but it gets weirder, so they head for home. But this makes no sense, since he has stated that he needs white spirit for some spillage on the patio tiles. He presumably still needs this, regardless of whether Annie will be painting. But before he reaches home, he changes his mind again and continues on past the house, and then loops back around to the DIY store. So he travels this loop twice. When he arrives at the store car park, he realises that he has no money. Obviously at this time there would have been no Apple Pay, so if you don't have any cards on you and you don't have any cash, then you can't pay. So he turns around. He never enters the shop, and instead he drives home. When they arrive back at the house, Lottie runs on ahead. She is the first person to discover the body of her 13-year-old sister lying on the back patio with blood pooled around her head. Billy Joe was beaten to death in the back garden of her home with an 18-inch or 45-centimetre tent peg or spike, weighing 2 pounds or 0.9 kilograms. The murder weapon was found near to her body on the ground. Also on the ground were the paint pot and brush she had been using for the patio doors. She was lying on the patio with her head on a bin liner, fully clothed. There were no signs of sexual assault. The house had not been burgled and did not appear to have been entered. When Lottie sees Billy Joe's body, she cries out to Sean, who ushers both of the girls into a playroom inside the house, whilst he calls 999. This call happened at around 3:38 p.m. When he is asked by the operator if his daughter is breathing all right, he replies, quote, "I don't know, I haven't looked," unquote. He estimates the time in which the accident could have happened, in other words, how long he has been out of the house for, and he puts this at, quote, half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, unquote. You can listen to the 909 call if you would like to. It's important to note that the murder weapon is not what most people think of as a tent peg. It's not a typical tent peg, not like one of the small ones with the metal end on one side and usually a plastic top, or the completely like small, really shiny metal ones that have like a hook on the top. It's not one of those. It's a kind of peg that was used to secure a large marquee. I have no idea why they would have had one of these, but she was cleaning out the cupboard, so it was more the size and weight of a tire iron or a small crowbar. After the first 999 call, Sean phones his neighbour Denise Lancaster, telling her that there'd been an accident. Denise hurries over, where she's directed to the dining room, and she goes out to the patio from there. She describes being scared to touch Billie Joe too much, and specifically to put her into the recovery position because of her injuries, so she doesn't want to put her into the recovery position, and she's too scared to touch her at this point. She did, however, gently touch Billie Joe's hand and cheek. At some point, Sean says he touches Billie Joe's neck and says that she felt warm. He describes her eyes as swollen and her head as misshapen. He tries to shake the blood off his hands and goes inside to wash this blood off. On realising the severity of Billie Joe's injuries, Denise tells Sean to call emergency services again and stress the urgency of the situation. Sean makes his second 999 call 8 minutes after the first, logged at 3:46. Denise returns to Billie Joe's side to take a closer look at her injuries and to try and staunch the blood by wrapping her head with a towel. She notices that something has been stuffed into her left nostril and discovers when she pulls it out that it's part of a black bin liner, such as the one that her head is lying on. A flow of blood is released from the girl's nose. As Denise removes the piece of plastic, Sean is still on the phone to emergency services at this point. The operator directs Sean to put Billie Joe into the recovery position and check her pulse, neither of which he does. The ambulance crew arrives while he is on the phone. Christopher Burton, who was a paramedic at the scene for the Sussex Ambulance Service, stated that Sean did not come out onto the patio at all as they attended to his daughter. Instead, he went out to his car, where he sat as paramedics attended to Billie Joe, who was later pronounced dead at the scene. On to the post-mortem. Again, warning for graphic descriptions. Billie Joe's body was examined on the morning of the 16th of February 1997 by pathologist Dr. Ian Hill. She was found to have died due to fatal blows to the head. She also had bruising and abrasions to her forearms and the back of one hand, which were deemed defensive injuries. In addition, she had bruising around her wrists, which appeared to be about a week old. The wounds to her head were described as random, but within close proximity to each other and caused by an estimated 9 blows. She had a broken nose and severe bruising to her left eye. She had a 2-inch by 2-inch injury to her right forehead, which had depressed her skull in an oval shape. She had 4 gaping lacerations, 2 of which revealed her fractured skull, which Dr. Ian Hill described as being fractured a bit like an egg shatters, which is an interesting description. The fracture lines had travelled down to both her eyes, ears and nose. Dr. Hill added that Billie Joe's brain had been badly torn and lacerated during the attack. Fragments of skull and brain were found matted in her heavily blood-stained dark brown hair. He stated that it was probable that the injuries to the front of Billie Joe's head were inflicted with the attacker standing in front of her, with those to the top caused while she was lying on the ground. Even though she had suffered devastating injuries to her skull, it was determined that due to the size of the weapon and the number of blows, it was, quote, reasonable to assume that extreme force was not necessary to shatter the skull, unquote. The murder weapon was found to have blood on both ends, which suggested that it was probably held in the middle rather than at one end. There were no fingerprints found on the weapon. The investigation was led by Detective Superintendent Jeremy Payne. It initially focused on 2 angles. The first were reports of a man who had been seen in the area in 2 days after the murder, police identified this 44-year-old man who is known as Mr. B. The man resisted arrest, with Detective Constable Dawn Briggs describing how she had held onto him and she was being dragged down the street. She said that he was very strong. Quote, "He tried to get me off him by grabbing me round the throat and kicking me in the shin," unquote. Mr. B was eventually restrained and taken to the police station, where 2 officers described seeing him holding part of a blue plastic bag up to his nose as he lay in his cell in a fetal position. They later found 2 more pieces of plastic in his underwear when they strip searched him. The potential link to this man's apparent obsession with plastic bags and the bin liner being stuffed into Billy Joe's nostril was clear. So it makes sense why they were looking at him, and also that he'd been found in the local area. Mr. B's clothes were tested for Billy Joe's DNA and came back negative. Since Mr. B was homeless and didn't have access to a change of clothes, this helped to rule him out. More importantly, multiple witnesses placed Mr. B at least 15 minutes away from the house at the time of the murder, so he was cleared as a suspect and released in psychiatric care. It does appear, however, that Mr. B was never formally questioned. He was placed under the care of a psychiatrist who refused to allow it on the grounds of Mr. B's active psychosis. The second focus for police was the derelict house next to the Jenkins property. Detectives announced that they were working on the theory that Billy Joe's killer had been hiding in this house and had observed the girl alone before attacking her. There was side access to the Jenkins back garden through an alleyway which ran along the wall of the vacant property next door. Lottie had stated that the garden gate was open when she discovered Billy Joe and that it had been closed when she was last at the house. This, combined with the family's reports of a prowler possibly casing their home in the preceding weeks, made the line of inquiry very promising. Nothing came of this lead, however, and it soon became clear that police had another suspect in mind. On the 24th of February, 9 days after Billy Joe's murder, Sion Jenkins was arrested. He was charged with the murder of his daughter 3 weeks later. The prosecution contended that Sion murdered his daughter in the time period between arriving home from collecting Lottie from her clarinet lesson and leaving to go to the DIY store. His daughters Annie and Lottie were outside the front of the house in the car when he did this, and he had approximately 3 minutes alone to commit the crime. That's what the prosecution said, according to the timeline that was discovered. Lottie and Annie were both interviewed the day after the murder. They each said that they went into the house on their return from the clarinet lesson. However, Annie states that Lottie went into the house as well, while Lottie doesn't mention Annie going into the house. They also both said that Sion went into the house. Crucially, Annie stated that she saw Billy Joe painting the patio and that Billy Joe said goodbye to her. Lottie said she didn't see or hear Billy Joe. Both say that they were then waiting outside the front of the house for their dad for a matter of minutes. So at least we know that Billy Joe was alive still when they left for the DIY store. Or at least that's what we think we know based on Annie and Lottie's statements. Annie's later statements to the police and to the police via both her mother and her neighbour separately differ and are contradictory. She reports variously that she and Lottie were outside the house for seconds, not minutes, that her dad followed her immediately out of the house and that she never went in the house at all. Lottie never wavered from her initial statement. Lottie also added that she noticed that the side gate was open when they returned from the DIY store, but it hadn't been open earlier in the day. Sean's initial statement was that he didn't see Billy Joe. So it's speculated that he initially lied about not going into the house to distance himself from the crime, but that he had to change his story because his statement differed from Annie and Lottie's statements. If he was innocent, why didn't he tell the truth in the first place? As then he could have been corroborated. Sean said both in his first 999 call and later in a statement to the police that he had been away from the home for 30 to 45 minutes. The time to drive to and from the DIY store took around 15 minutes. He simply drove to the store and back again. The focus of the case against Sean was the blood found on his clothes. There were 158 microscopic spots of Billy Joe's blood on his fleece jacket, trousers and shoes. The blood spatter on the clothes was consistent with the spatter on Billy Joe's leggings, and the prosecution's forensic experts argued that such spatter could only have happened when the teenager was attacked. The neighbour who had cradled Billy Joe and wrapped her head wounds did not have blood spatter on her, and neither did the two paramedics who had contact with her. The prosecution's experts also strongly refuted the defence's case that the blood spatter found on Sean's clothes had come from Billy Joe exhaling the blood onto him. One expert testified that, quote, "I have no doubt at all in my mind that I regard that as impossible in the state that she was in with that head injury," unquote. He added that it was, quote, "highly unlikely that Billy Joe could have inhaled the 2.2 litres of air necessary for her to exhale forcefully enough for the blood to spatter," unquote. He said, "I still doubt whether she would have been able to inhale 2.2 litres with a gasp, but I accept that at the very worst she might have been able to. It is very unlikely, but I can't say it couldn't possibly happen. I am talking way out on the extremes of what could happen in extreme situations." When asked whether such gasping would have been visible, Professor Southall replied, "Extremely visible. Anybody approaching a child with an injury who is gasping would be in no doubt whatsoever that the child was breathing and definitely still alive, and would report to that because it would be so obvious to an observer. It would be obvious because the observer would want the child not to be dead and would be looking for signs of life." There was nothing in Sean's statements or testimony that showed Billy Joe had any signs of gasping or breathing. Another expert told the jury the nature and the distribution of bloodstains on Sean's clothes was entirely consistent with the results of the wearer of the clothing having delivered several blows onto wet blood, and the clothing having intercepted an impact mist of blood as a result. Before the start of the third trial, the prosecution sought to admit the results of new forensic tests which showed that the blood spots found on Sean's clothing also contained fragments of Billy Joe's bone. This would probably eliminate the possibility that those spots were transferred to Sean's clothing by exhaled breath from the dying teen. But the judge refused to allow it after ruling that defense counsel were told of the evidence too late to be able to examine and challenge it properly. There was white spirit in the home, which means that Sean did not need to drive to the DIY store to buy some, which was one of the reasons he provided for going. The journey already seemed a strange one, but now police suspected that it had been entirely manufactured as a reason for Sean to distance himself from the scene and create an alibi. Sean had told the second 999 operator that he had turned Billy Joe over and put her in the recovery position when he was asked. But he did not do this, and he later admitted it. Apart from this specific lie, ambulance that Sion had done nothing at all to try and help his foster daughter, given that he later claimed that the blood on his clothes was due to Billy Joe exhaling onto him. In other words, he believed she was still alive. Police were curious why, when he saw her body, he spent time calming his other two daughters in the house rather than calling an ambulance immediately, especially if he thought she was still alive. His other observed behaviour raised suspicions. Ambulance staff found it odd that Sion did not stay with Billy Joe whilst they were attending to her. He went out to the front of his house and sat in his car. Police suspected that this was to have an excuse for Billy Joe's blood being in his car, in case he transferred it on his trip to the DIY store. His other lies include that he had lied on his CV when he applied for the deputy head teacher job in Hastings. The extent of the lies that Sion told are important, especially considering the job he was applying for. He had lied about the school he attended and his university, but he also lied about the degree that he had, the education certificates and other academic qualifications he had. A close family friend testified that he'd witnessed Sion kick Billy Joe on her ankle after she had twisted it, and that Sion had been furious with her at the time, but afterwards had behaved very calmly. The friend also testified that Sion was annoyed that Billy Joe had an accident and had told her, "You are always hurting yourself when I go away, every time there is something wrong." Two of Billy Joe's school friends gave hearsay evidence at the second retrial that Sion had been violent towards her, as in Billy Joe. Jenkins testified that Sion had a temper and was violent. Quote, "When he lost his temper, we never argued. He never shouted. He would just lose it, snap, and in a few moments he would be back to normal," she said. She testified to various specific incidents of violence towards herself and physical discipline of the children. However, this testimony was not subject to cross-examination as it was only given at the appeals hearings, but not allowed into the retrials. Billy Joe could be, quote, "quite feisty and challenging," unquote, according to Lewis. By Sion's own testimony, she would, quote, "destroy items of clothing or hurt herself, ripping the heads off dolls," unquote. The day of the murder had been a frustrating one for Sion. There had been a series of petty mishaps and wasted journeys. He had argued with Billy Joe earlier in the day, according to his wife. So, as there's no evidence of an intruder and there's no motive for anyone to kill Billy Joe, she had defensive wounds from the blows to her arms, but there was no sign of a prior struggle and there was no sign of her trying to run. There was no sexual assault, at least no signs of it. No dislodged or torn clothes and no grab marks. Whoever did this went straight to hitting her in the head, but they didn't bring a weapon with them. They used one previously placed in the garden by Annie. Sion was the only other person who knew that it was there. However, we do have to look at both sides of the argument. So let's look at the defence. So, according to the prosecution, the crime, if it had been committed by Sion, it would have been committed within 3 minutes. A few minutes is the absolute maximum amount of time anyone's statements have ever allowed that Sion was alone with Billy Joe. Between the clarinet and DIY journeys, Sion himself says that he was not alone in the house for even this amount of time, and Annie's second police statement backs this up. It's an incredibly short and unlikely amount of time for someone's anger to be triggered, to hit someone to death, to stuff part of a plastic bag into a nostril, and then to clean up to some extent. and at least washing their hands. Since neither of his daughters had noticed any blood on his person, and the blood spots that were found were microscopic, so they could not be seen by the naked eye. Sean testified that when he found Billie Joe's body, there was a small bubble on her nose which later disappeared. His defense argued that the blood patterns found on his clothes could have been caused by the bursting of this blood bubble when Sean was close to her. The defense used a textbook by American blood expert Dr. Herbert MacDonald, who said patterns from so-called expirated blood from the mouth or nose could result in patterns somewhat like blood misting. However, one of the defense experts in the first trial actually agreed with the prosecution that the blood spots could have been caused by impact spatter. He said that, "I have considered whether they could have got there as a result of her exhaling droplets of blood from the nose, or whether this is a combination of both blood spattering and exhaling. I cannot say. These are very difficult areas as to make a decision as to whether blood is truly impact splatter or may have resulted from coughing blood." A consultant neurosurgeon for the defense said that in his opinion, and based on the amount of blood he had been told was found at the scene, Billie Joe could have been breathing for 15 to 20 minutes after the attack, which is just awful to think about. The court also heard how prosecution forensic experts tried to recreate the attack and resulting blood patterns using props. The defense pointed out that in the experiments, right-handed scientists found many more blood spots on their right sleeve compared with their left, but when Jenkins' fleece was examined, there were 21 spots on his left sleeve and 3 on his right. He was right-handed, which makes it seem that it wasn't him that did it, at least not for those blood spots to be found. The pivotal evidence in Sean's successful appeal and in the subsequent retrials came from Professor David Dennison, one of the UK's leading experts in lung disease. He found evidence of what he believed was a rare condition called pulmonary interstitial emphysema, or PIE. This meant there was a build-up of pressure in Billie Joe's lungs, which Professor Dennison claimed happened in the minutes after the attack, before she died. He believed this was caused by blood blocking her airways, and that some of the blood was released after Mr. Jenkins moved her, sending a spray of droplets which landed on his clothing called expiration spatter. Professor Dennison reconstructed the conditions of the murder, this time taking into account the pressure in Billie Joe's lungs, and created a similar pattern of blood. Quote, "My experiments show that you can generate from the mouth and nose the sort of spatters that were found on Sean Jenkins' clothing, and the distribution is almost identical. The size of the droplets is almost identical, so it is a very, very credible explanation," unquote. Sean refutes almost all accusations of violence against his wife, against Billie Joe or his other children. The exception is an admission that he once slapped Billie Joe to the face. The defense did bring character witnesses, most notably a priest, who stated that Sean simply could not have committed the murder and was not a violent man. Between 1993 and 1997, there had been 45 burglaries in Lower Park Road. Sean and his family had been bothered repeatedly by a prowler to the extent that they were considering moving. While the incidents were not reported to the police, Sean is backed up by Lois and close friends and neighbours. The house next door to the Jenkins was derelict and was next to the alleyway leading to the back garden where Billie Joe was murdered. Someone could have seen or guessed or heard that Billie Joe was alone. Lottie had observed that the side gate had been left open and that she had seen it closed earlier that day. On to the proceedings. Sean Jenkins was tried for the murder of Billy Joe a total of 3 times. He was convicted of murder in the first trial. Following appeal, a retrial was ordered. A hung jury led to a 3rd trial, and the same result led to Jenkins being officially acquitted. Not all evidence was presented at all 3 trials, so we will go on to a timeline of the legal proceedings, which summarises how the evidence was different in each trial. So, 1998 was the first trial. This trial centred on the blood evidence. Sean was found guilty unanimously and sentenced to life in prison. The jury did not hear evidence regarding the lying on his CV or evidence of previous violent conduct. Lois, Annie and Lottie did not testify. Lois was his wife, Annie and Lottie were his daughters. In 1999, an appeal based essentially on 2 premises, one being new blood evidence and 2 being that his daughters not testifying harmed his defence, and also that Lois influenced Annie's statements to police. The appeal was dismissed and his conviction was upheld. In 2004, a 2nd appeal was made. The conviction was quashed and a new trial was ordered based on new blood evidence. Judges specifically rule that the daughters not testifying wasn't detrimental and Lois had not influenced her daughter's statements. In 2005, the 2nd trial happened. The jury heard new evidence regarding blood for the defence. The jury did not hear Lois Jenkins' testimony about Sean's alleged domestic violence. The jury fails to reach a verdict, which led to a 3rd trial. The 3rd trial happened in 2006. The blood evidence is very much the same as the 2nd trial, and the result is also the same. The jury failed to reach a verdict. The jury do not hear Lois Jenkins' testimony about Sean's domestic violence. New forensic evidence of bone fragments on Sean's clothing is not admitted. The prosecution decides that they will not seek to retry the case, meaning that Sean was acquitted and cannot be tried again for the murder of Billy Joe. The police investigation, trials and appeals are estimated to have cost £10 million. So, on to other suspects. The first suspect that were considered, and still could be considered, is Anthony Emilia. That M25 rapist Billy Joe's murder has been linked by some to the so-called M25 rapist, who had lived in the area and committed a string of rapes and other assaults. In December 1996, Billy Joe had told friends she was being stalked by a man in a leather jacket. According to those who knew Anthony, he almost always wore one. In addition to this, he often improvised weapons in his attacks and once had put a plastic bag over a victim's head. However, his first known attack happened nearly 4 years after Billy Joe's murder, and he was very prolific, committing 10 assaults in just over a year. He also always sexually assaulted his victims, with all but 2 of them being raped. He didn't attack his victims in the way that Billy Joe was attacked. He died in prison in 2018. As we discussed, Mr. B was considered a viable suspect by Sean Jenkins, and he maintains this. He stresses that Mr. B was never interrogated, as a psychiatrist refused to allow it. Mr. B was indeed seen around the area of the Jenkins home at the time of the murder, and multiple people found his behaviour suspicious or disturbing. However, he was placed some distance from the crime scene when Billy Joe was murdered. It is possible that people could be correct about the time that he was seen. However, that would mean that multiple witnesses would be wrong, which makes this unlikely. The other other suspect is an unknown stalker or prowler. Billy had reported to friends that she believed she was sometimes being followed, and this had been going on since around Christmas time. She was murdered in February. She described to friends that the man was white, in his 40s or 50s, and always wore a leather jacket. This description matched that of the man Sean had told police on the day of the murder had been staring into the family's home 2 weeks before. The Jenkins family had been concerned that their property had been trespassed on other occasions by a prowler. In addition to the above talk of someone following her, Billy Jo had reported 2 years before that she was being stalked. She told her parents and friends about this, and both the police and her school were informed. She had also received a number of strange calls around this time, where the person on the other end hung up before speaking. It is unclear if she believed that the stalking/following 2 years apart to be the same man. There is no indication that she told friends or family that she thought it was the same man, and the more recent incidents were not reported to the police when the first had been. A man with at least one burglary conviction allegedly confessed to the murder of Billy Jo to a cellmate. The alleged confession happened in 2002, but the inmate did not inform police until 2 years later. Police did question the man, but nothing seemed to come of it. The confession was reported to the police the year before the second trial, and yet the defence did not use this information, so it seems safe to conclude that this was not a credible suspect. Sean Jenkins claims that in the hour or so after Billy Jo's death, he spoke to a man in the hallway of his home. The man was not in police uniform, but Sean says he was aware that he was an officer. He says that this man cannot be identified and was possibly an intruder in his home. Sean says that he was not aware at the time that this man was not in fact a police officer. It only occurred to him years later as he recalled events in the process of writing a book about his experiences. So that is the gist of the case. That's all the information I have for you. I'm just going to actually tell you what we know about Sean Jenkins now and what he is up to, as far as we are aware. So, after being released from prison when he was acquitted, he was actually refused compensation from the Ministry of Justice. He sought up to £500,000 in damages for the prison term that he served, but the Ministry of Justice rejected his request after his case was assessed. Although he believed he fitted the criteria for a payout, the compensation rules state that applicants for miscarriage of justice payouts must demonstrate that they are clearly innocent, which makes sense since the final verdict from the last trial was that it was a hung jury, so it was again not really a considered outcome. It was interesting to me though that he was considered to not be clearly innocent, but also not guilty enough to have his conviction upheld. I don't know, it just seems like they kind of were like, there's been 3 trials, we can't be bothered with this anymore, whatever, we're just leaving it be now. He lives in Hampshire as far as we know with his new wife Tina. He divorced his ex-wife Lois and married Tina in 2005. He studied criminology at Portsmouth University following his release. He also stood as a Conservative Party candidate in local elections. In 2010, he told The Guardian, quote, "I still dream about being in prison and often find myself thinking about all that had happened. I don't think I will ever be able to put what happened behind me, but I don't want sympathy from anyone. Compared with many victims of miscarriages of justice, I have a good life," unquote. Sean Jenkins does have a book which was published in 2009. It's called The Murder of Billy Jo, and it was written alongside Bob Woffington. It's basically his chance to tell his side of the story, and I believe he also goes into some of the theories that the police had about who actually did the murder of Billy Jo. I haven't read it, so I can't say whether it's I'll read, but it might be interesting to see from his point of view what happened in his case and how it affected him. There is also a 90-minute documentary on Channel 4 which you can watch, which examines the unsolved case of Billy Joe's murder. It includes interviews with Jeremy Payne, the detective superintendent on the case, as well as interviews with Billy Joe's friends from school. So it's definitely worth a watch if you can still access it. I have watched it, but it was quite a while ago, so honestly I might watch it again because I've forgotten most of it. So in 2022, the Sussex police said that each unsolved murder is assessed 2 yearly to examine any new information that may have become available. Currently, no new information has been provided in this case, and it is not being reinvestigated. But they are carrying out a forensic review of material held on the case in order to establish whether or not scientific advances can provide new evidence or lines of inquiry. But as I said, that was from 2002, and I personally haven't heard anything since then, so I don't think anything has been decided from that or any new lines of inquiry are in place. So on to your thoughts. I want to know what you all think about this case. It's a very interesting one, and it's also very sad. Billy Joe was only 13 years old at the time, and she had already been through so much in her life. It's really awful for this to have happened to her, for someone to have done this to her. So what I want to know is, do you think that Sean had enough time in those 3 minutes where himself, Annie and Lottie arrived back at their house, and he supposedly went inside, according to himself he did. Did he have enough time in those 3 minutes to lose it, first of all, to get so enraged that he did this, to do the murder itself, to stuff the bin liner into Billy Joe's nose, wash the blood at least off of his hands, compose himself enough to exit the house and join his daughters back in the car? Do you think an intruder theory makes sense in this case? There was no evidence of attempted sexual assault, no burglary. There was no evidence that Billy Joe had run away at all, so it sort of implies that she probably knew the person in that case, or she at least wasn't scared enough to run. There's no sign of a struggle before the murder started, before the attack happened. The attack was quite brutal, so it's either got to be somebody who knows her or possibly somebody who has mental health problems, like who would have motive for a murder of that kind of severity, of that kind of passion. The murder weapon was not brought to the scene and it wasn't taken away, so you would think if somebody had planned this that they would at least take the murder weapon away, or at least try to, disguise that in a way, in case their fingerprints had been left behind, or perhaps they had wiped their fingerprints off of the weapon and that's why they left it. I think that both the prosecution and defence had compelling blood evidence at the last 2 trials, but the bone fragment evidence wasn't admitted into the third, which really doesn't make any sense to me. I feel like from that standpoint there's no way that blood spatter from her lungs, which is what that doctor suggested, was it Dennison? That Dennison suggested that it had come from her lungs, because of a condition that she had that they didn't know that she had. There's no way that that blood from her lungs would have bone fragments in it, so how did Sean have blood on him that had bone fragment in it if he hadn't really touched her? danger if it had been submitted. I feel like surely it would have been. And how suspicious and how much thought should be given to the odd behaviour of Sean with his DIY drive, the changing of his statements, and along with the blood evidence. Do these things add up to guilt in your minds? Do you think that they made the wrong choice and that actually he's guilty? I do think, a lot of people will go somewhere and maybe change their minds about it, but I think because people think that he did it and then used the DIY store as an alibi, it's just weird to think people do go to travel somewhere to buy things and forget their money, but it's weird that that happened to him at the time that this was happening, So, I don't really know. I feel like the bone fragment in the blood can't really be ignored, but is it possible that he got that on him when he was around her in a different way? I don't know, really. I'm not a scientist or a doctor, so I don't really know, but I do think it's just an aggravating case in that way. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts. Do you think that elements of his power in a way and potentially his privilege came into play here? I do think it's interesting that he managed to get away with lying on his CV. I think times are different now. I don't think you'd be able to get away with that nowadays. At least not lying about having degrees and education qualifications, because there are lots more background checks nowadays, but I do think it's interesting. And it's also evident that he has lied before about things, and there's evidence of that in the trial as well, like when he said that he didn't go into the house when his daughter said that he did. So anyway, please let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments. I'd love to have a chat with you about it. And of course, my thoughts as always are with Billy Joe and also her poor biological family who, obviously they had a really tough experience and there were things going on with them as well which cannot be ignored. But it must have been really hard for them to hear that, they hope that she would go somewhere where she is being taken care of, and to find out that this happened to her must have been really difficult for them as well. So I'm also thinking of Lois as well. I imagine that it was quite difficult for her, and it obviously was because her and Sean split up, so there must have been reason behind that. These statements that Lois gave about the alleged domestic violence should have been in the trial, as it paints a picture. Let's not forget that women are usually killed by somebody that they know. Anyways, I went on a ramble, but let me know if you would like to see more videos like this. And rest in peace, Billy Joe Jenkins.